This is the Jedburgh podcast. I'm the creator and host, Fran Racioppi. Each episode, I speak with transformative leaders, visionaries, drivers of change, and those dedicated to winning, no matter the challenge. The Jedburgh podcast is founded in the lineage of the special operations Jedburgh teams of the past and is produced in partnership with Talent War Group, a management consulting and executive search firm focused on helping you optimize the people side of your business. We're sponsored by Jersey Mike's Subs. Together, we share the mission of giving, making a difference in someone's life. Visit the Jedburgh podcast, Talent War Group, and Jersey Mike's Subs on the web and on social media. A percentage of all proceeds is dedicated to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. A nation asserts leadership and influence in a variety of ways. The Army taught me that a nation is defined by how effectively it leverages the four elements of national power: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. The world order, which has stood since 1945, is today being tested in every corner of the globe. The results of international affairs are affecting our own economy here in America. Many days, it's hard to watch the news and make sense of it all. I'm joined on this episode by former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, a political leader who's been at the forefront of national and international decision-making for decades. The speaker and I spoke strategy across the elements of national power, including the effectiveness of our diplomacy in the war between Russia and Ukraine, and the precedent set for our dealings with China, North Korea, Iran, and other nuclear-capable nations. We broke down the effect on the economy, the ways to stem inflation, rising oil prices, and the point at which the U.S. economy cracks into a recession. Speaker Gingrich questioned the decision to take the military option off the table and defined the danger of hoping for a good outcome. And we spoke about the next generation of American leaders, the importance of investing in education, and what it means to be a superpower in the new world order. Regardless of which side of the aisle you sit on or what you believe in, America is greatest when we question each other, choose strategy over tactics, and lead from the front. Mr. Speaker, welcome to the Jedburgh podcast.
I'm glad to be with you, and I love the concept of trying to look at things strategically, and I'm delighted with what you're doing.
Well, I have a very strategic level policy and doctrine conversation lined up for us. Sir, no one knows more than you the importance of the term leadership matters. You've led this country for the better part of 60 years. You've seen America at its strongest. You've seen us at our most vulnerable. You've been a strategic thinker at the national and the international domains. Today, we sit at a time that most of us don't remember. Many of us have never experienced this. There's strife and confusion at home. In the economy, there's racial and ethnic divide. Safety and security is questioned in our own communities. We have brinksmanship abroad at a level in which we may have possibly never seen. The world order, in many ways as we know it, as we've become accustomed to, is changing. It's being questioned. The world's watching our every move. Friend or foe are calculating their next move based on what we do. It's so hard to sit back and watch what's going on and not look for answers, take a stand, take action. To have a discussion on the world today, we have to frame this in the context of what I learned as a special forces officer, and that is what's called the four elements of national power: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, or DIME for short. These elements, as you know, are the tools by which a nation asserts its power, asserts its influence. It's how they effectively lead, how they lead themselves and how they lead others. Today, leadership is challenged by world and domestic events across all of these elements. As we said, you're a strategic thinker. I figured that these topics would be a prudent way to frame our conversation, and I thought we'd start primarily with diplomatic, because that seems to be what so many of us are talking about right now. It's our international efforts, the treaty, interaction abroad. I'm wondering from your perspective, as you look at what's going on with leadership in terms of the situation in Ukraine, potential war with Russia, our relationship with China, proliferation by Iran and North Korea as they test our diplomatic prowess in every corner of the globe, to us, the normal person, it looks half-baked in so many ways. How do you assess our diplomatic efforts across these fronts over the past couple of months?
Well, I think you have to start with the notion that diplomacy is inherently part of the executive branch. The president's role as commander-in-chief makes any president preeminent in making these decisions. And the team that the president surrounds himself with shapes the options and the execution that defines results in the real world. What you have today is sort of Barack Obama's third term. And there's a pattern when you get into third terms that all of the really good people left and went to make money or went to do something else, and you're left with the last stand of the mediocrities. And I think that's what you're faced with. You have both in the Defense Department the degree to which the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was wrong about Afghanistan, the degree to which he was publicly wrong about Iran, the Ukrainian campaign. He and Putin both believed that the Russians would be in Kyiv in 3 days, and he said so publicly, which even if he believed it, it was stupid to say it publicly because it had to undermine the morale of the Ukrainians, who luckily have learned to ignore Americans and don't care what they say because they regard this administration as hopeless. Biden himself, I presume, has a sort of classically international view of the world from a left-wing standpoint. There's a reason that Bob Gates, the former head of the CIA, former Secretary of Defense for both George W. Bush and Barack Obama, there's a reason that Gates said that in 40 years Biden had consistently been on the wrong side of every foreign policy issue. And that's what you're seeing now. It is hard to overstate the pathos of watching the most powerful nation in the world avoid providing leadership, lie about what it's doing, and for some reason be so committed to creating Iran as a counterweight to Israel, that and so committed to having Russia as its partner doing that no matter what Putin does, in the end, Biden relies on the Russians. And historians will look back on this period, and I suspect if there's a Republican Congress next year, they'll have hearings on this because it is almost unimaginable how destructive the Biden administration is being, how much it is weakening our role in the world, how much it is sending signals to dictatorships that they can get away with things, and how much human pain it's causing by its utter inability to be helpful to the Ukrainians in a way that would really work.
We've made this situation, this conflict right now about Russia and Ukraine, but what precedent, and you alluded to it, and you referenced other dictators, other nations in the world are watching this, but what precedent is this setting for China and China's interaction with Taiwan and Iran, North Korea? As they look at us, what's going through the minds of those leaders?
Well, not just there, but I think virtually every medium-sized country is going to conclude that they need to get nuclear weapons. If Ukraine had had nuclear weapons, Russia couldn't have attacked it. The idea of relying on us for our guarantee will be seen by most countries as such a weak position that the value of the American endorsement, at least while Biden is president, will be virtually useless. Xi Jinping, I think, has to have I suspect the jury's out. I mean, my personal guess is that Biden will cave the second he has an excuse to do so, that Putin will end up winning, not conquering all of Ukraine, but getting agreement that he has eastern Ukraine, that he keeps Crimea, that Ukraine commits to not basically to what happened to Finland after 1939. They commit to being neutralized, having a much smaller military, and living in the shadow of Russia. And then Biden will declare victory, find a way to drop all the sanctions, and go back to working with Putin. And if you look at the Iranian negotiations, we have the Russians right in the middle providing leadership in the negotiations with the world's leading sponsor of terrorism at the very moment that we claim that we want to isolate Russia. So this is not incompetence. This is a worldview which wants to have a dramatically weaker America and which wants to have a dramatically weaker Israel.
When you think about leadership, you just mentioned it here, leadership comes to the forefront, front and center in times of crisis. The president, regardless of the opinion polls on either side, rises to the fore, and everybody looks to the president for leadership and direction. We're seeing in this current conflict three very different leaders: President Biden, Vladimir Putin, Volodymyr Zelensky. When you look at these three from the standpoint, and you've worked with leaders at every level and every capacity in all situations, when you look at these three individuals, how do you assess how they've handled this conflict?
Well, I do 3 free newsletters every week at Gingrich 360, and I did one recently on the bear, the lion, and the bunny rabbit. And I said, in the classic tradition of Ronald Reagan's 1984 commercial, that there was a bear in the woods, that Putin's behaving like the Russian bear, to the shock of everybody, including, I want to remind you again, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of the American, and apparently the American intelligence community, which was totally wrong apparently about Afghanistan and now has been wrong about the campaign in Ukraine, which makes you wonder why we spend that many $1 billion on 17 different intelligence agencies. But Zelensky has proven that the Ukrainians are lions. And in a fight between the bear and the lions, the leader of the United States is a bunny rabbit, hiding, pretending nothing's going on. If you watched the emotion and the power of Zelensky's speech to the Congress and the flat, boring tone of Obama, what Biden read yesterday, it is appalling that this is a guy who doesn't want to deal with this. He recently gave a fundraising speech to a Democratic audience. He had one sentence that obliquely referred to Russia and Ukraine, and the entire rest of the speech was on climate change. Now, in the middle of a major war, disrupting the entire orderly structure that has existed since 1945, for a president of the United States to have the opportunity for a major speech and not devote a large part of it to what's happening in Ukraine and the threat of Russia is because climate change is a greater threat. And you may remember that John Kerry the other day said that he certainly hoped that Putin would remember climate change as he invaded Ukraine. Now, you have to be close to committable as an insane person to have those kind of attitudes. And that's what you're dealing with. This is a religion. As Theodore White said in 1972, the ideology has become a theology. It's not debatable. If you're not of the true faith, then you can't teach at Harvard and you can't serve in the Biden administration. So they're limited to people whose limited contact with reality makes them impossible. But people should not think this is incompetence. The border is not open because they're incompetent. The failure to effectively arm the Ukrainians or the Taiwanese is not because they're incompetent. They are doing what they want to do, and they're doing what they believe in. And I think that's the core background to remember.
Mm-hmm. I want to switch to economic, the E and dime. Our economy has been jolted by COVID, unemployment, stimulus, supply chain shortages, and now rapidly rising oil prices. We're effectively seeing the canceling of an entire nation, a superpower-like nation in Russia, and we're threatening China now with the same if they support Putin. There are calls in Europe to move the world currency away from the U.S. dollar. How much shock can the U.S. economy sustain before it cracks, before we launch into a recession?
Oh, I'll be very surprised if we aren't in a recession by 2023. I lived through this with Jimmy Carter, who had high unemployment and high inflation. Simultaneously, we called it stagflation. Reagan, when he campaigned in 1980, had a great line. He said, when your brother-in-law is unemployed, it's a recession. When you're unemployed, it's a depression. When Jimmy Carter's unemployed, it's a recovery. And I think that, we have to recognize that the inflation's out of control. It's going to get worse, not better. And it's largely a function of having just put too much paper money in while adopting policies which limit supply. So if you are weakening the ability of the economy to produce goods and services while you increase the purchasing power, the inevitable result is inflation. And the American economy will, in fact, face substantial inflation. Now, the difference between us and the rest of the world is, at least up till now, we have a pretty ruthless ability to weed out the weaker companies and to encourage entrepreneurs and to invent the future pretty rapidly. So I would still bet on us, particularly over the Europeans or the Chinese, who have way too much state control and who can't deal with the objective realities of a real market. But I do think that it's almost inevitable now that between Biden's anti-business regulatory posture, their pro-tax increase posture, and their absolute hostility to things like the oil and gas industry, combined with their desperate need to spend the money. They have to pay off their union allies and their big city governments to function, and as a result, they're pouring cash into the economy and accelerating the inflation rate. And I don't see any way out of it except to ultimately have a sufficiently strong tightening up that you're going to have a fairly significant recession, probably in 2023.
You called for an Operation Warp Speed for energy independence. It was an article I wrote the other day. What does that look like? How do we begin that? How do we gain support for something like that?
Well, I mean, all it would have to take is the president to repeal his various executive orders that were anti-oil and anti-gas. I mean, the fact is, Biden inherited a country that was essentially producing more energy than it was consuming, that was in a great position to replace Russia as the supplier of natural gas to Western Europe, and that was in a position to drive down the cost of oil and gas, which probably harms the Russians as much as any single thing you can do. But I mean, Putin right now is making well over $1 billion a day in selling oil and gas on the world market. That allows him to finance virtually all of his military and his military adventurism. And so I think that nothing would do more to get his attention than to get the price of oil back down to where it was under Trump, which was about $46 a barrel. And look at the difference in the amount of money Russia gets between, last time I looked, it was like $1.15 a barrel. And the difference is just astonishing in terms of sheer profit to the Russian system.
Mm-hmm. So the M in military in DIME is military force. They say that military force is the last line of diplomacy. You mentioned it, and it's talked about every day, but President Biden has been clear that very publicly that we will not engage in military direct conflict with nuclear armed nations. We've stayed on the sidelines, yet we're providing aid. And you can make an argument that, the level of aid that we're providing, and now another $800 million, almost $1 billion approved yesterday. Are we not in it? Is the question that you have to ask. But yet we don't support even a limited no-fly zone. Is the military option really off the table?
Well, it is for this president. I mean, if you go back and you look at Reagan, Reagan didn't actually use the military very much, but he built it up to be such a strong force that nobody wanted to test him. Mm-hmm. And I think, for example, I think right now we should probably be moving 3 divisions into Eastern Europe. The Poles would love to have them. The Baltic states would love to have them. And you don't have to say we're going to fight. You just have to say, if it ever happens, we can fight. And I think one of the great shocks has been the remarkable ineffectiveness of the Russian forces. It's very clear that they've not developed an NCO cadre capable of operating the way ours does. People don't realize it, but as you know from your own background, the non-commissioned officers, the sergeants, the warrant officers, they really drive the system.
Mm-hmm. It is the Army.
And when you deal with a military in which the officers have to do the non-coms work, it is inherently a slower, weaker, less effective military. And I think when you also deal with a military which has not really had practical wartime experiences for a very long time, and it turns out that they can't do anything very complicated. They've been moderately effective in Syria because they've been running very small forces using their elite units and asking them not to do very much that's complicated. When you start trying to coordinate 80 or 90 or 100,000 people, you have a totally different scale of complexity. And I think that people tend to forget that when we are able to send an expeditionary force, say, to Iraq, we do something that nobody else on the planet can do. And I suspect from Xi Jinping's standpoint, because he's a very smart, very tough guy, I suspect he's asking himself, am I really as confident that the People's Liberation Army could effectively cross 160 miles of the Taiwan Straits and be successful? Remember, the Germans at their peak couldn't figure out how to cross 21 miles of the English Channel.
Right.
160 miles is a long amphibious operation unless you have total air and sea superiority. And I suspect that in some ways Xi Jinping may be a little more cautious right now, not a little more aggressive.
Are we buying time? Are we? And I ask that question because I think about in the military, if you ever briefed the term hopefully, you were immediately given a 0 and you were kicked out of the room. But it feels in so many ways that we're playing this game of hopefully, that hopefully Putin will back down. Hopefully Putin will be deposed and someone who's more aligned with Western ideology will come in and replace him before he decides to use chemical or weapons of mass destruction. Do you get that impression?
Well, look, my view is that liberals deal with violence, whether it's violent crime at home, terrorism, or people like Putin, almost as though they had seen The Lion King and thought that it was a documentary. So they actually get up in the morning and they think that lions and zebras are going to sing and dance together. And conservatives try to explain to them, no, lions actually eat zebras. And they go, see, that's a sign that you just don't get it, that you're some right-wing reactionary. And so I think that it's very likely that Biden really deep down thought that there was a pretty good chance Putin would not attack, and he failed to arm the Ukrainians, and he failed to cut off economic aid from the International Monetary Fund for Russia because he didn't want to, quote, push him over the edge. This notion that, which was something which Hitler played on brilliantly in the late 1930s. And so I think it's just like you have to look at the whole Iran negotiation and say to yourself, are these people just totally crazy? Now, the answer, I think, is probably yes. And that's a real problem because they're taking a country, in the case of Iran, which is currently actively trying to kill American officials. It is currently firing missiles close to the American consulate in Iraq. It has been labeled by the State Department, even under Biden, it has been labeled the leading supporter of terrorism in the world. It is, given all of that, why would you want to strengthen them and empower them, give them greater capacity? And yet this administration is determined to do it. And you may remember that when Kerry had the original deal where they sent $1 billion, not in U.S. dollars but in euros and in Swiss francs, literally an airplane filled with $1 billion flew into Tehran, and Kerry was reassuring everybody as Secretary of State that, of course, they're going to spend most of it improving the quality of life of their people. Well, we know that's not true. They spent most of it, one, building nuclear weapons and missiles, and two, funding terrorism across the entire Middle East. So in a sense, the Kerry negotiations have made possible sustaining the Houthis in Yemen in the ongoing civil war that they're engaged in. The Iranians are providing drones and other long-term missiles to the Houthis so that they can literally attack Saudi Arabia. And in the middle of all that, the Biden administration is just desperate. It's so desperate to get an Iranian deal that it's brought the Russians in. So at the very time that Biden says that Putin is a war criminal, it is Putin's ambassador who is the leader in putting together this Iranian deal. Now, you can't explain all this. This is not incompetence. This is an ideological worldview, which is extraordinarily dangerous and runs a real risk, I think, of degenerating into a major war.
The I in dime is informational, and I want to tie this into leadership more broadly, especially in this country. So much of our information comes from our leaders' ability to communicate. You're one of the greatest communicators of our time. You led this country as part of a generation that saw firsthand the effects of tyranny across the world. You took over willingly from the greatest generation, and you created a world in which my generation knows nothing more than prosperity, safety, comfort. And for my generation looks to yours and continues to do so to this day to solve our problems. Yet it is time, in my mind, for my generation to stand up and lead. You look around and you see other countries putting my generation of leaders into their senior positions: Canada, England, France, Italy, Germany, and even Ukraine. And yet today we're questioned by so much of the world. Ukrainian soldiers have questioned our status as a superpower and our leadership. When you look at the next generation of leaders in America, what do they need to effectively retain superpower status of this nation and carry us forward for the next 20, 40, 50 years?
Yeah, well, I would say it's not so much being a superpower in the arrogant sense as it is sustaining a capability to ensure that freedom and safety survive and that the American people can be prosperous and safe and free. The consequence of that would be being the most powerful country in the world. But I think we should understand why we want to be powerful. It's essentially a defensive position that protects this extraordinary country and that protects our extraordinary freedoms in a world where all of them are in danger every single day. This may surprise you, I would say the number one challenge we have is the education system, because we're literally not producing people today capable of competing with the Chinese. And if we don't fix our education system, nothing else will work. So I would start there, and I would develop a lot of other things from that point. I think we need to insource back home a lot of the manufacturing capabilities that we had cheerfully sent to China. I think that we have to have a very tough attitude about the Chinese efforts to penetrate our society. I think we want to build the biggest possible coalition. I mean, we have had an extraordinary ability to have allies, and we should remember that we've, since the Civil War, with the singular exception of the Spanish-American War, we don't fight wars without allies. And that gives us an enormous advantage over all of our various competitors. And I think we want to continue that. We also have to, I think, dramatically accelerate in space, where we're being saved by people like Elon Musk, despite the government. And we have to, I think, understand the emerging new technologies of cyber and quantum and electromagnetic pulse and artificial intelligence and nanoscale science. I mean, there are a lot of cutting-edge things out there that, if we're not very careful, we'll have a big, cumbersome, bureaucratic national security system incapable of modernizing because it threatens too many people's soft, comfortable, traditional positions. So we have a lot. I think we have more work to do today than at any time since 1941 in terms of trying to get this country back on its feet and get it focused on being effective and competent.
Sir, as we close out, the Jedburghs, and you and I were talking about the Jedburghs before we started this, but the Jedburghs had to do three things every day to win or to be successful in their plight in France against the Germans. They had to be able to shoot, they had to be able to communicate, and they had to be able to move. If they did these three things as core foundational tasks with the utmost precision, then their energy, their focus could be focused on other challenges that came their way. In your career, in your life, I'm wondering the three things that you do every day to set the conditions for your success. And I ask all my guests this.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can totally identify three. Well, I would say, first of all, I read 3 to 6 hours a day just to try to keep up with what's going on. And I'm very fortunate because I have a guy named Terry Balderson who is a retired research director who got very bored and decided that he would be my voluntary research director. So he gets up very early every morning, scans the internet, and sends me between 100 and 200 interesting things to look at every single day.
Wow.
Plus all the normal correspondence. So I would say first, just intaking information. I would say second, I have a very serious process, which I learned partly from Peter Drucker and Edwards Deming and partly from the Army's Training and Doctrine Command. And it's two very different things. One is that leadership is a 4-word system of listen, learn, help, and lead in that order. And the second is that planning starts with vision and then strategies and projects and tasks. And so every day I go through those two patterns. And I guess if I had a third thing, it would be that I see every day as a gift from God. And I ask myself, what am I doing today that justifies my being here? And I try to consistently reorient myself to the most important and the most critical tasks so that I can maximize my helpfulness. I mean, I guess that's probably as close as I can come to answering what you ask.
No, those three are perfect. Read to keep up with events and intake information. Have a defined, serious process of where listen, learn, help, lead, plan, vision, strategy, project, tasks, right out of the doctrine, as you said. And every day, understand why we're here. Focus on the most critical tasks. So the 9 characteristics of elite performance as defined by Special Operations Command are used to recruit, assess, and select all special operators regardless of their branch. And they're one of our core values here on the Jedburgh podcast: drive, resiliency, adaptability, humility, integrity, curiosity, team ability, effective intelligence, and emotional strength. Every one of the guests that I have on exhibits all of these and their ability to perform their tasks every single day and achieve the success that they have. And then I take one of them and I think about the conversation we had, and I think about my guests, and I say, when I think about you, this resonates with me. And I think about effective intelligence for you, Mr. Speaker, because effective intelligence is the aggregate sum of our experiences that we put together, and we allow that to shape our future actions, our decision process, our perspective on the world, and we share that with others. You've been a leader in this country for a long time. We're so grateful for your leadership for all these years. You have chosen so many times strategy over tactics and put this country at the top of the world in so many different ways. I thank you for your time. I thank you for your leadership, and I thank you for your service.
Thank you for doing this thing. It's a great concept.
And I thank you for your service.
Thank you for doing this thing. It's a great concept.
American Jedburghs went on to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh podcast. I'm your creator and host, Fran Racioppi. Join us next week for a new episode on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Check us out on YouTube for full episodes, highlights, and other behind-the-scenes content. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow me, Fran Racioppi, Talent War Group, and our sponsor, Jersey Mike Subs, on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Send your comments and inquiries to media@talentwargroup.com. As former members of Special Operations Forces, the Jedburgh Podcast and Talent War Group contribute a percentage of all profits to Special Operations Warrior Foundation, supporting the families of our fallen warriors. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.